Ms. Langrell, I am just terrific, and yourself. It's Friday. It's always Happy Friday. I continue my vacation on Friday. And it is. You get to a certain spot. What's I looked at the
Supervisor Rutherford, are you on the line? I haven't heard anyone join. And I heard she was here today.
She was here.
You guys are so something. Sorry about that.
Okay, so you guys are good, right? You don't need me anymore, right?
Well, good morning, everyone. Our chair is running a few minutes late, so he asked that we go ahead and get started without him. And I think as a special gift to him, we should show him just how far in the agenda we can get without him, yeah? So let's start by going around the table and doing quick self-introductions. Janice Rutherford, San Bernardino County Supervisor, Governing Board Member. And we'll start down at the end here. Welcome.
Eddie Marquez, Alon Energy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Paul Avila and Associates.
John DeWitt, J. DeWitt Incorporated.
Rita Lufratic.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Jeff Blake, Small Business Alliance and Metal Finishers Association.
Lavon Daniel, Danco.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Fabian Wesson, Public Affairs.
Derek Alatorre, Public Affairs.
Cynthia Moran, City of Chino Hills.
Press the red button.
How about that? Good afternoon, Rachel Arizmendi, Mayor with Sierra Madre and also with PACE, Pacific Asian Consortium Employment.
Felipe Aguirre from Maywood.
Elaine Hill, South Coast HMB. Lorraine Grell, HMB staff.
Right, thank you, everyone. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from our April meeting. Did anyone have any concerns with those minutes? If none, is there a motion?
There were a couple of things in here in the meeting that, or in the minutes, that just didn't seem to make sense. On page 2, at the third paragraph from the bottom, it says, Bill Lamar asked about the reclaim facilities presently subject to an aggregated emissions cap. If there is a plan to deaggregate these facilities under the program, Dr. Tsopoulos requested to be respectful to the advisory group's time constraints if the members of the group can make a list of questions and bring them to the working group presentation. and I guess that was kind of open-ended. I don't have an exact recollection, but was this just any time that we did this, or
So why don't we do
going to be
this?
scheduled for another presentation from Lockheed?
Yeah, I think what he was asking for is any additional requests, and that we can agendize them in the future. But with regards to I think what you're concerned about is maybe the way it's written.
My question to him was, does the staff have a plan? Which was kind of a yes or no answer, or we're working on one, or something like that. But I didn't want to belabor, this body with a whole lot of questions that aren't even relevant to major sources, or more. Now they might be a couple of people here, but
So why don't they do this? And you tell me if is Lockheed, sir? Oh, Lockheed. You want to talk about this item? So,
Oh, there you are. I'm sorry, I didn't see you over there.
do you want to go ahead and
No, Lockie, I was referring to the last month's meeting when I asked what I hoped was a straightforward question is, do you have a plan for deaggregating reclaimed facilities? And then when I was reading the minutes, you had suggested that we all formulate different questions, and I didn't want to do that. I just was interested. Do you have a plan? Do you not have a plan? And if you do, is one working? Is one in process of being developed? And when might we expect it? That's all.
Very quickly,
I was suggesting, because I'm not the one working on that phase out project, that you bring those issues and questions to the Reclaim Working Group and try to sort through all those issues through that avenue. That was my suggestion.
Oh, so that would preclude a yes or no answer even at this working group meeting. Huh?
I'm not working on that project, so I couldn't really
Oh.
intelligently respond to
He
your
could flip a
question.
coin and give you an answer, but it's not going to be the actual
It would be
answer.
fair.
If you'd have said not my job, or if the minutes would have done that, that would have been okay. But thank you.
Well, looking at that, I do notice in the minutes on agenda item 5, we've got a confusion of our barked versus backed in the title versus the abbreviation. So if we could just clarify those. And Bill, was that a second to the minutes after your question was resolved? All right, we have a motion, a second. Any objection to the minutes? Hearing none, they are approved. Mr. Alatorre, follow-up items.
Thank you, Supervisor Rutherford. So there's two action items, and first of all, if I start coughing, I apologize, just can't get rid of this cough. The first one was to agendize a presentation on commercial leaf blower program. We are going to agendize that possibly for June at our next month's meeting. The next one is to agendize a presentation on SB1, and that's going to be actually done today, so that is already on the agenda for today. And then the other item is to agendize or receive information pertaining to driverless trucks, and those are in the handouts on the table, so if you're interested, you can get them from the table there. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to our first presentation, which is remote sensing technologies.
Right. Good morning, everyone. So today, I'll give you a summary of some of the work that we conducted in monitoring and analysis in the past couple of years or even more. And so in terms of, just to give you some background, in terms of VOC emissions, there has been scientific studies conducted in the past 20 years or so that started showing that if you measure the emissions coming from refineries and you compare them to emission inventory estimates, most of the time the measured emissions are higher than what you get through the emission inventories. Most of these studies have been conducted in different parts of the world, in the US mostly, in Texas. And as I'll show you later, we wanted to basically conduct our own study to verify, these claims by other scientists. And, oh, sure.
Are you measuring, staying with refineries in the South Coast District, or are you measuring all over the world?
Well, this background slide is for refineries all over the world.
Okay, so that's not going to, do you find that's not typical of what's going on in California?
This is what this presentation is all about.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, though.
You're Andrea. Andrea.
Andrea, yes.
Okay, got it.
Correct, sorry. Yeah.
Question, an easy question.
Yeah. Well, I get it all the time that they think I am Miss Andrea Polidori, but I'm used to that. So also, there are thousands of oil wells in the South Coast Air Basin, and most of these wells are right next to residential areas and right next to homes. And that's a map with basically the location of all of the oil wells that we could identify in Southern California. There's a lot of them. Most of them are active. Some of them are not. But in general, actual emissions from oil wells and other small sources are highly uncertain. So one of the other objectives of this study is to try to understand what VOC emissions from oil wells and other small sources are, and how these collectively contribute to emissions from stationary sources. Just like for oil wells, even gas stations, there's a lot of gas stations, of course, in Southern California, and all over the world. And if you take one gas station alone, emissions, most of the time they are not elevated. But one of the questions is that, if you combine all of the gas stations, what is the contribution in terms of VOC to the total emissions from stationary sources? So this is another question we wanted to ask. We wanted to answer, during this study.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
With respect to gas stations, and I guess oil wells too to some extent, but particularly gas stations, is what you're proposing to do or doing duplicate in any way what ARB has historically done with vapor recovery systems and underground storage tanks and everything like that?
So this study is all about measurement. So there is this category of instrument that is called optical remote sensing, and it has been developed. They have been developed throughout the years, and one of the most commonly used ORS system is called Dial. It was developed by Chevron actually 20 plus years ago. So like the main purpose of our study is to actually take measurements around refinery and around small sources, including gas stations, to measure the actual emissions from these sources.
So what you're I guess what you're saying is that the Air Resources Board has never done measurements, never included measurements of emissions as part of their enforcement and their rule writing?
They have, but I think that what we have done here is maybe one of the first, if not the first, comprehensive effort to use different techniques to measure emissions from all of these sources, not just focusing on gas stations and oil wells, but also we have focused on other small sources. So I think as I go through the slides, it will become more clearer, I think, what the scope was and what we have done.
Does any, last question maybe, does any of these operations require the gas station to shut down, even for a few hours or for a few days or whatever?
This is a technology demonstration project. So everything that we have found, I'm reporting the results, and then eventually, throughout the years, I don't know, maybe they might impact the way that we, develop our rules. And but for the moment, I'm just talking about the technology and what we have measured and what we have found.
In the course of your measuring, that doesn't impede, does it or does it not impede the gas station's normal operating?
No, in short, no. Right. We started, we have a program at the South Coast, it's a fence line monitoring program, and we started back in 2008 to demonstrate the feasibility and effectiveness of some of these optical remote sensing methods. And we wanted to evaluate the performance of these instruments so that we can eventually improve leak detection and repair programs and provide real-time alerts to to communities that are located close or nearby refineries and other potential sources, and also to try to use this technology to estimate emissions from large industrial facilities, including refineries and other sources. So we started back in 2008. by evaluating, the performance of one instrument is called DOAS. I will not bore you with the technical details, but, and then throughout the years, we started collaborating with local universities, including UCLA and a Swedish group that is called FluxSense. And, in 2013, we basically conducted a very short study to estimate total emissions from a couple of refineries in the South Coast. Then in 2015, we ran a more comprehensive study that lasts for about 2 months, late in 2015, to measure and quantify emissions from all of the 6 refineries in the South Coast Basin, and also to estimate the total emissions from small sources. And so, I'll show you a summary of the results from this 2015 study. But, we are increasing our effort in terms of, evaluating and hopefully soon, applying some of this technology for leak detection and other purposes. So the 2015 studies, we had 3 different projects. Project number 1 was about quantifying fugitive emissions from large refineries. Project number 2 was about quantifying gaseous emissions from small point sources, including gas stations and oil wells. Project number 3 was about quantifying stack emissions from marine vessel and from the overall port area. And today, I have just limited time. I was asked to present only results from the first 2 projects, but maybe I can tell you a little more about project number 3 too, if there is some time. So for project number 1, about quantification of fugitive emission from large refineries, we work with 3 different vendors. FluxSense, they are a Swedish company that develop a spectroscopic method that is called SOF, which stands for solar occultation flux. They have this and other instrument inside a van, so they are very nimble. They can drive around refineries, and they can tell you, if there is a potential leak from one or other parts of the refinery, and they can also estimate total emissions. So, the pros are that they conduct mobile measurements, but they can only conduct measurements during the daytime, not at night, because they use the sun basically as the source of light. Second vendor that we work with for this project is NPL, National Physical Laboratory. They are from the UK, and they use a well-established method that is called dial. They are extremely accurate, so they can tell you, with a very high degree of accuracy, how much, for example, what the emissions are from a specific plume coming out of a storage tank, for example. This instrument is mounted inside, is set up inside a very large trailer. So it's fairly difficult to move around. So for the most part, it's used for validation. So because they are very accurate, but they are not very mobile. The third vendor that we work with is an Israeli company called Atmosphere, and they use a well-established method called FTIR that has been EPA approved. And what they can do, it's a fixed installation, so unlike the previous 2. So they can set up one of their instruments downwind of a potential source, and then they can take measurements 24/7. So the advantage is that you have continuous measurements over the long period of time. However, it is a fixed installation. You can only measure whatever passes through, this instrument, the path of this instrument. So during this study, basically, we use FluxSense as the primary measurement method, again, because they are very versatile, very mobile, and we use them to measure emission from refineries, from all of the 6 major refineries in the basin over a 5-week period. What they can measure methane, non-methane, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and they can also measure NO2, SO2, and BTEX. The MPL, it was only 1-week study inside the tank farm of one refinery in the South Coast, but they can only basically measure everything that FluxSense can measure. And lastly, Atmosphere, they installed one of their instruments downwind on the west side of one of the major refineries to measure concentration of methane and non-methane VOCs. Okay, so this is just a very good example of one of the applications of the FluxSense method. I don't have access to the laptop, and I think somebody needs to click on the. But while driving around inside one of these refineries, their instrument basically, recorded very high concentration of alkanes. And so we were able to identify basically, yeah, over there. So it's not, the quality of the video is not very good, but it shows that they, just by driving around and they were able to identify an underground leak. So actually the leak is at the surface, but was coming from an underground pipe about, I believe, 30 centimeter down on the ground. And that's, I think it was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's a VOC coming out of the ground. And so the measured alkane concentration at that point were about 70,000 ppb, which is a very, very high concentration, with an average VOC emission of about 31 kilogram per hour, which is also very high.
Is this the technology that was used at Aliso Canyon?
No, this is different.
It's different.
Yeah, Aliso Canyon was mostly for methane. And
but I mean, where the public could actually see.
Yeah, this is a FLIR camera, similar to the FLIR camera you saw footage.
Not the same, but similar then.
Right.
Yeah, you're correct. Sorry, I was thinking about the VOC portion.
But what's a little different is the data on the right is what they captured when they were driving by, and that's where you can see the green and the red as they were driving by this area. That's what alerted them to the fact there was something going on. And then they happen to have with them our FLIR camera. And if I remember correctly, we have the FLIRs that we bought about a year ago. We were renting them for a long time, and now we've actually bought a couple for our units that are out in the field. And that's what they pulled out, and then they saw this coming out of the ground. You could walk by and not see this at all. But with the FLIR camera, you can see it right there, obvious. And so they have a couple of these. So you do,
Right.
Go ahead.
Right.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Yep. Okay, and I mean, again, I'm not sure if, are we allowed? So this was at Tesoro? Yeah. And of course, we work with the inspectors to, identify the exact source of the leak, and within like 3-4 hours, they were able to repair it. So, but I mean, again, this is, gives you instantaneous feedback about what's going on, and that's one of the main advantages of this technology. And this again, we showed it before. This is actually the Tesoro refinery. It's not a secret. You can, and this is how the FluxSense technology works. So they drive their vehicle around the refinery many times, and they also collect wind information. So as you can see, for this particular example, the wind was blowing. Actually, was blowing from the west. The coordinates are a little. Screwed up in this example, but you can see the wind direction, and you can see that the height of that blue line represents the amount of VOC that was coming from the refinery. So you can see that upwind of the refinery there was basically no VOC or very minimal VOC, but downwind of the refinery they were measuring very high concentration of VOCs. So the way that they calculate the emission rate, they subtract the upwind contribution from the downwind contribution, and then they multiply essentially the concentration of VOCs by the wind speed to calculate an emission rate. And in this particular example, basically it shows that most likely there was a lot of VOC coming from the tank farm that you can see on the corner there of this slide, and we conducted, more detailed measurements inside that tank farm specifically to confirm that that was the case. And I'll show you some of the, the main results in the next slides. So, so in terms of emission in kilogram per hours, like the figure to the left shows total emissions from all of the 6 refineries that we studied during, the project number 1. And also, the same information can be reported as throughput normalized emission. So you basically divide emission in kilogram per hour by the throughput of each refinery. And so just to give you an idea, most refineries throughout the world have a throughput normalized emission of 0.03 and above. So this is to show that, again, maybe relatively speaking, the refinery the 6 refineries in the South Coast are relatively clean. And again, this is a relative term because, I mean, of course, they emit VOCs, but compared to their refineries in Texas and in other parts of the world, they are cleaner than those. The next slides, I think this is possibly the main result of the entire Project One study. So if you calculate the ratio between measured emissions at each refineries and the inventory estimates at those refineries. So if measured emissions are the same as inventory estimate, you would have a ratio of 1. But as you can tell from the blue column there, the ratio was between about 3 and 12. So basically that means that on average, the refineries, according to our measurements, were emitting 3 to 12 times more than what it is reported in the emission inventories. This is in terms of VOCs at least. And also we calculated the same ratios for SO2 and NO2, and especially for NO2, the ratios were a lot lower and very much close to 1, meaning that what is reported in the emission inventory for NO2 is very much in alignment with what we measured during this study. So there are 3 columns there. The blue column is the ratio for VOC essentially. The yellow column is the ratio for SO2. And the red column is the ratio for NO2. The blue is VOCs, yes. Yeah. The biggest variation, yeah, the biggest discrepancy. Okay, so this, I'll talk a little more about project number 2, which was about quantify gaseous emission from small point sources. And essentially we work with the same, type of technologies. There was only, the difference was there was one vendor that was operating the FTIR was different. But essentially FluxSense measured, different measured emissions from about 100 small sources, including oil wells, intermediate oil treatment facilities, gas stations, and other small sources. And NPL basically focused on a subset of these small sources. And CASE, the vendor operating the FTIR, concentrated their measurement on about 50 small sources, also including gas stations and others. This is an example of what we found just driving around in the Signal Hill area. This is a very small treatment facility. So downwind of this facility, the concentrations of alkenes and of benzene in particular were very, very high. Just to give you an example, on average over a couple of days, we measured about 21 ppb of benzene. That is a lot higher than what we measured during the MACE-4 study, where the annual benzene average for benzene is about 0.4 ppb. So we are talking about more than 40 times the level of benzene downwind of this facility. And this is located in residential areas, and although maybe you cannot see from the pictures, there are businesses and residential homes downwind of the facility. And so we investigated a little more about what the possible source for benzene from this facility was. And Lucky's about to play another video there to the left. So we think that, again, using the FLIR camera, we were able to see that the main storage tank inside this facility was leaking. And yeah, I was very conservative with that. Yeah, it was a valve that was malfunctioning, and both the FLIR camera and all of the equipment that we used, including the dial, as you can tell from the picture to the right, the red means very high concentration of VOCs. So using 3 different technologies, we were able to basically confirm that there was a leak from this tank. So what we did here, obviously we couldn't measure emission from every single gas station, every single oil well, every single storage tank in the basin. But what we did, we calculated an average from each source category. We multiplied that average emission by the number of emission points in the basin, and then we basically built that pie chart to the right to kind of assess, how much each source category contribute to the total. And I think the main results here is that oil wells contribute about 54% of total emissions from all of the stationary sources in the basin. Again, this is a rough estimate, but the message is that oil wells as a whole may contribute to total VOC emissions much more than we previously thought.
I have a question here, and I know you haven't gotten to your pie chart, and forgive me, but my eyes are going bad. I can't read this. What's on the pie chart?
Me neither. From here.
But since God didn't create all VOCs equally, the ones that you're seeing these anomalies on or undetected emissions, these are the same VOCs that wind up in mobile sources, right? And they're different from the VOCs that you might see in a manufacturing sector. Yeah, so I guess where I'm going with this is this also going to, or should it impact rulemaking on stationaries, or not all? I can't hold you to that, but I mean, in most stationary sources where VOCs are present, because VOC is just another word for small business. I mean, it really is. I mean, look at your 1100 series rules. I mean, but that's what it is. Or selective small business.
The short answer is what we are seeing is that we are underestimating the emissions inventory from certain sectors of our industry, not from all stationary sources. And as we move forward with our future plans, probably we'll have to pay close attention to those specific sectors that are associated with a lot higher emissions than we previously thought.
So far, you've only identified about 2 or 3 sectors now, is at least that's what I'm hearing from your presentation.
And again, the purpose of the study was not necessarily to identify candidate sectors, but rather to assess the strengths and weaknesses of these optical advanced monitoring technologies in quantifying emissions.
Well, you have to find out what you have first.
Yeah.
All right.
Definitely. And one of the questions we had is that you compare the emissions from a gas station, right? Obviously, it emits a lot less than a refinery, but you multiply that number by 3,000 plus, which is the number of gas stations in the basin, and as a whole, as a category, they emit more than refineries. So.
And this fuel finds its way to.
We did not consider mobile sources here, and it's just all of the sources that we measured during this study. That's what the pie chart refers to.
Clarification on the subject is a very interesting subject, and it's very helpful to identify these type of problems. But is this graphic intended to say if the same type of phenomenon happened at all these facilities, what the inventory might be? I'm trying to understand what the inventory you're listing here really is, or is this an estimate with a hypothetical?
So this is not a reference to the inventory. This is only based on measured emissions. The reference to the inventory is only when we compare, basically measured emission from refineries to the inventory estimate. So the pie chart is only measured emissions.
So this is actual measured emissions using this technology.
Correct.
And then my question really is, using that, how are you relating that to the inventory? And where I'm coming from is, if you go and find a problem, how typical is that, and how would you estimate the emissions overall from a sector based on some observations that may not be indicative of 24/7 operation?
Andrea, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but with the oil wells and the gas stations, basically the vendors took a statistical sample and they made their measurements, and then they took those average measurements and they extrapolated to the rest of the universe, of the oil well and gas station universe, and that's what you see in that pie chart. With respect to this particular slide, where it's comparing the observed emissions by those technologies from our 6 refineries, 6 large refineries, to what is being reported to us under the conventional methodologies, reporting methodologies. And clearly it shows a discrepancy with respect to the VOC emissions. We are okay with respect to the NOx and SOx emissions, but with respect to the VOC emissions, there is a variance of 6 times, I can't see that far away, 6 to 12 times. So we are grossly underestimating the VOC emissions, not the SOx and.
Just whenever someone says statistical information, I want to dig down a little
Oh,
deeper.
Yes.
But
With
so I
respect to the
understand.
refineries, there is no statistical because we looked at all the refineries. With respect to the oil wells and the gas stations, it was a
So
statistical
I
sample.
understand the analogy. It would be something like you have really good data on one type of facility, say oil field, whatever it may be, and you use this technology and say, you know what, what we can see is you're really over your actual inventory by a certain amount.
Right.
And once you have good data on that particular facility, then you're extrapolating that upon other facilities you don't have actual data upon. Is that a good way to characterize it?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, your question is to the point, and it's very good because, I mean, to be fair, this is only representative of the September 2015.
Okay.
This is it's a snapshot, and we also need to acknowledge the limitation of the method. The method only works during the daytime, as I said before. So we don't really know what happens during nighttime. There's plenty of other measurements and other studies that shows that more or less daytime or nighttime that are more or less equivalent. And there's not much difference between September, other parts of the year, and especially in Southern California where the weather is pretty much, not that variable. But I mean, your question is very important because, I mean, again, we need to acknowledge all of these differences, all of this variability, and even the uncertainty of the method, which is plus or minus 30%, which is not small. So,
Thanks for the clarification.
This should also change too, I would imagine, when the refineries change to summer fuels, right, and winter fuels too? No, or you don't know?
Probably it won't vary all that much.
I'm sorry?
I don't believe it will vary all that much because in 2015, it was summertime that we took measurements, and in 2016, it was what, September, October?
we mostly did it in 2016. It was, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and it was right around when they were switching the fuels.
Right.
We didn't see any appreciable difference, to be frank with you, between the two measurements.
Right.
Lucky and Andrea, keeping along the extrapolation highway, let's say that FluxSense and Casey, both the equipment manufacturers, developed the same type of technology, same type, same wheels, same measuring instruments, all the way down the road. And both of these companies take measurements at the refinery, and they're different. Now what?
And we have done that, actually. I wanted to keep the presentation relatively short.
Sure.
But we basically, during a couple of weeks, we had all of the three technology at different points inside the tank farm of the Tesoro refinery. So there was one particular point in time where they all detected a leak, potentially a leak, an increase in VOC concentration, massive increase. And all of the three technologies measure this well, it's not exactly the same emission rate, but within like 20%, which is, very good considering that they're using. So we had two different ways of basically validating the performance of each technology. One was through co-location inside the Tesoro refinery. And the second one, and I'm glad you asked, is we organized this technology intercomparison in the parking lot of the Anaheim Stadium, where we had, I'm sorry, there is a third video, if you don't mind. So right in the middle of the field, excellent. So we had, a platform there with, we were able to basically release propane at different emission rates and a different height. And so we knew exactly the emission rate. The South Coast, myself and my staff were the one kind of varying the emission rate. And we had all of the 4 vendors in this case, either driving around or somehow measuring, emissions from that particular source. And so this is how they perform. This is the dial technology from MPL. And as you can tell, this is a correlation. Basically you have in the y-axis the released emissions from the propane tank versus what they measured with their technology, and it's pretty much in one line. So they were, in this case, perfect. The R-squared, the correlation coefficient is basically 1. It cannot get better than this. And even for the SOF, which is the flux sense method, they basically ended up, the correlation is very high, it's very close to 1, but they ended up underestimating the propane emission, mostly because they were very, very close to the source, and they were not able to catch emission that were very close to the ground for the most part. But it's within the uncertainty of their method.
Is it correct to say you have a separate sensor for each parameter, and that has to be calibrated for what you're trying to detect?
No, they detect, FluxSense detects alkanes and BTACs, they detect them all.
So you're using propane for the calibrant, or
only propane in this case, because it was, we couldn't use benzene, of course, right?
Right.
And so it was non-odorized propane, so
okay, I assume
nobody would be affected.
Depending on what the compound is, you're going to have a little bit different correlation depending on the complexity of the hydrocarbon?
Ideally, if there was nobody around and everybody was wearing a mask, you could release like a mix of VOCs that would include all of the major VOC categories.
Not recommending that.
Thank you. I'm sorry?
Nobody asked for a mask.
No, and there was a fire station that was about half a mile away, so. Sorry. And so this was the intercomparison study. And in short, to conclude, we thought that, these optical remote sensing technologies provide a very good characterization and quantification of, different industrial emissions. We found them to be reliable for fence line monitoring because they allow you to basically identify very rapidly potential leaks from refineries and other sources. And that they can also provide real-time alarm system for communities that are living near the refineries. So in summary, for project number 1 and 2, there may be a discrepancy between measured and reported inventory emissions for VOCs, for refineries and potentially other sources. And for project 2, oil wells, gas stations, and other small sources, are substantial contributors to the total VOC emissions from stationary sources, and the results from these ORS methods are in very good agreement with each other, as I showed towards the end. Yep.
Rochelle, you have a question?
Thank you for your presentation. I may have missed it, but what is the intent of how to use this data? And also, is this public data or is this internal at this point?
So for project 1, we just released the final report maybe a month ago. And we are building a website, and it will be posted there. But the report, as far as we are concerned, is final for project 1. We are finalizing the report for project 2. We have an internal review period. I think it will end actually on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday. And after that, it's just a matter of finalizing the report and then circulating it internally, get approval from upper management, and then eventually it will come out. for the most part, this was a technology demonstration project. So we intend to conduct more studies. I mean, as I said, one of the limitations is that for the refineries, we only have data in September. We have a contract with FluxSense, and they are conducted measurements for 2 weeks every quarter for the next 2 years. So we want to address some of the limitation, get more data to see if this discrepancy between measured and inventory still persists, in January, February, throughout the year. And we are also trying to see if this type of technology can be used as an alarm system for communities, and see if we can identify and quantify, VOC concentration within the communities. And this has not been done before. And within that study, we are kind of merging, this type of technology, which is extremely expensive, $1 million plus, with small sensor technology that are like $400 or $500, and see if the two combined can tell you something more about potential community exposure. Sure.
I'd like to add one thing too. Everything that Andrea said was correct. The additional portion of it is also to get. I can't hear you. The additional. Thank you. So one of the additional things that I'd like to add to all the Andrea's explanations is that it's also to give feedback to the facility so that they are also aware that there's this potential leak at their facility, and to give them potential pointers of where the location of that emission may be, so that they can investigate and potentially repair that issue.
Andreas, on the service station sites, were those sites identified that have installed enhanced vapor recovery?
Not 100% sure of that. What I remember is that we took measurements, for example, at Costco, very new gas stations, and their emissions were minimal. And most of the problem tended to be on kind of older gas stations, like it's more like mom and pops type of gas stations that have been in operation for quite a while. And then, but in terms of whether or not they are compliant with the QMD rules, I don't think.
So we're not sure that they have installed the required, on some of the sites, enhanced vapor recovery that came out about 6 years ago.
So we don't know whether 100% of the stations that were tested, had the enhanced vapor recovery. But one of the lessons that we learned from the gas stations, as well as through the measurement campaign with the other sources, refineries and oil wells, emissions are not uniformly distributed, among the different facilities, and has very little correlation with the throughput. There are super large stations like the Costco's that Andrea was talking about.
Yeah,
they're very well maintained, and their emissions profile were minimal. And yet you go to some other smaller ones, perhaps they don't have the means to maintain, to do just as good of a maintenance job, and their emissions profile were a lot larger. In the refineries, the same thing. They are very tightly controlled and maintained, most of their units, and they have hundreds of thousands of potential emission points at a single refinery. And yet, one tank, two tanks, or one unit here and one unit there, there would be the super leakers, and they'll dominate the entire facility's emissions profile. So one of the lessons learned, if we have a technology like this that is fast, and they can allow us or allows the operator to identify that leaky source, fix it, I think we all can be winners. And basically that's what happened with that, well, we didn't show the tank. Well, one of the tanks that Andrea was showing, it was one of those examples. Or the roadway, where we started seeing smoking. What happened was, we are driving on the roadway. These techniques, the computer screen basically showed a spike that we couldn't believe. We said, there is no way there's going to be emissions on the middle of the road. And yet, the concentrations were so high, as the Chair Benoit indicated, we pulled out our FLIR camera, and sure enough, we started, the cloud, the smoke, coming through. The Tesoro started digging. They found out the corroded pipe, from who knows how many decades ago, and they fixed it right away,
There was pinhole in,
Yeah,
in
but
a little pipe that connects
that's
all of
the
that.
power of those technologies, basically. Provide that feedback to the operator and make them be a lot more efficient because they spend millions of dollars, each one of them, through the leak detection and repair program, but they do this once every quarter. Now imagine if they have, these technologies at their disposal, they could do it on a daily basis, within their facility or on a weekly basis.
And to very good point, both the question and the answer. And that particular facility, again, we said it already, it's Tesoro. More than 50% of the total emissions were coming from 2 tanks.
They got a lot more than that.
They got a lot more than that. Yes.
Yeah, my question, this gentleman in the back here that made the comment about having that information accessible to the refineries, I think that's very valid, and also put some kind of time frame on there.
Sure.
Not put the thumb screws to them right away to fix it in an hour, but within a certain amount of time. That's very important, and if it's shared, if that's shared information, I think it's really great, if it is.
Yeah, and in fact, we are trying to kind of work with them to basically, kind of build an emission reduction program that would take this technology into, that would basically complement what they have with this technology. So, yeah.
Bill, did you have another question? Or, I'm sorry, John.
Comment and a question, I guess, is that so what I'm hearing is that when you're talking about leak detection, a refinery is full of tens of thousands of pipes, valves, fittings, flanges, and so it sounds to me a lot like enhanced maintenance would go a long way in reducing emissions, solving the problems, and everything. I've been doing this long enough to know that it would be one thing to set up a program for enhanced maintenance rather than jump right into rulemaking where industries, everybody is tarred with the same brush on this. And that's one of the things that the regulated community just shudders at. So I hope that that's an option or approach that you're going to consider when you finish all of this. The other thing, you change the slide, but I know I've asked this question earlier. The other small sources or other small industrial sources, do you have an idea of what those might be or what they are? It was an earlier slide that you had here just before or after this one.
Smaller sources, I think it was the oil wells, the gas stations,
You had oil wells, gas
the
stations.
tank farms.
Treatment facilities.
Which ones?
Treatment facility, intermediate.
And treatment facilities, that's all we looked at.
Are you going to be looking at the coatings industries?
No, I don't think these are the best technologies to look for coating-related emissions.
Even those, the ones that use volatiles, I mean, where there's
Sure, but these techniques work well with sources with, relatively speaking, large emission signatures.
you can get more bang for your buck there
Yes,
for
yes.
your investment of
Right.
time. And, yeah,
Right.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Very good. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
My apologies for running late. I was in the city of Arupa Valley. The governor was there to sign a bill that has been plaguing my city for the last 6 years. The VLF money, we finally got it back. So, yay! Can finally breathe a little easier. And of course, we still have to wait for the check to come in. There's still some debate on how much money it is. There's all sorts of questions, but at least we're finally moving in the right direction. I'm just happy he was there and willing to sign it finally. So he signed the wrong part of that form so many times. I was just making sure he signed the right side of that bill. So, all right. So on to the next item, the Carl Moyer Program Award.
Yes, I'm Fred Minassian from our Technology Investment Office. Vicky White was supposed to give this presentation. She's on jury duty today, so I'll substitute her. And I'll be talking about our Moyer program that our board approved the program announcement release at its April meeting. It's the 19th year of this program, and the state's longest running and most successful incentive funding program for mobile sources. Just give you a brief history of the program. The Carl Moyer program was established in 1998 based on the suggestions of Dr. Moyer at the time that was working at Accurex. He was a very well-known scientist and thought the incentive funding program may be helpful in reducing emissions from mobile sources rather than imposing a whole lot of regulations. So the first 6 years of the program, funding was provided as part of the annual state budget approved by the governor, and NOx emissions were the only pollutant that was considered in the evaluation of the projects. And at the time, there were not many rules and regulations, especially on the off-road side. So basically, any equipment qualified for the program, and it was easy to fund the programs at the time. The program evolved throughout the years, and after a few years, particulate matter was added as a qualified pollutant to be evaluated based on its cost effectiveness. And due to toxicity of particulate matter from diesel emissions, Air Resources Board assigned a multiplier for PM as part of the cost effectiveness calculations. The other thing that started to be considered under the Moyer program was funding projects in disproportionately impacted communities. At least 50% of the projects were basically as a goal to be considered for funding in addition to being cost effective. Each air district adopted its own methodology of disproportionately impacted areas. And in our case, it was a combination of poverty in areas of 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, if it was in excess of 10% of the population in that area. And also we considered cancer risk and particulate matter exposure. So combination of those 3 factors were considered as disproportionately impacted areas. NOx, VOCs, and PM are currently the qualified emission reduction pollutants for this program. And also the emissions that are achieved under this program are SIP creditable. Even if a project is co-funded with other funds and partially by Moyer funds, the entire emission reductions are credited to SIP by Air Resources Board. After 6 years of the program being funded as part of the state budget, due to the success of the program, CAPCOA sponsored a bill to provide continuous funding for this program. And 2 legislations were passed, SB 1107 and AB 923, to provide continuous funding for this program. AB 923 has 2 components, a tire fee and a smog check fee. In our case, we get $2 DMV fee from all the vehicles that are registered in our basin. That's about $24 million. And each air district had to adopt that part of the legislation locally to be able to collect the $2 DMV fee. So not all air districts are collecting that, but the majority are. Then there's a 75-cent tire disposal fee that goes to the state and is distributed among air districts. And the other part is called smog abatement fee, and that funding source was created by postponing the first requirement of smog check for new vehicles from 4th year to 6th year. Instead of that, for 6 years, $6 smog abatement fee was actually $12 a year. Smog abatement fee was collected or is being collected. Half of that goes to ARB through Air Pollution Control Fund and is distributed for the Moyer projects throughout air districts. The distribution of funds is an agreement between CAPCOA and ARB, and we get 44% of the total funds that ARB distributes is based on the population of people in our basin. The type of equipment that are funded is listed there. There's a diverse collection of equipment that can be funded on and off-road, locomotives, marine vessels, cargo handling equipment, and so on. And our district basically is the district that funds the most diverse type of equipment. And anything you see there, we have funded through our Moyer program throughout all these years. Last year, about a year and a half ago, we realized we had come to a stage that with the adoption of all the rules and regulations, there was not many equipment we could fund. So on paper, we were able to fund them, but in reality, we couldn't provide a whole lot of funding, especially on the on-road side. So the number of applications had decreased. The regulation, was presiding over those categories, and the delta, the emission reduction, had decreased compared to the beginning of the program. So SB 513 was introduced by CAPCOA and approved by the governor in October of 2015. And what this legislation does is the most important parts are that depending on the type of technology, it raises the cost effectiveness limit. It allows the leveraging of the funds. So if a project is funded by Moyer program funds, it can be leveraged with federal sources and other sources such as greenhouse gas emission reduction funds, as long as at least 15% of the incremental cost is 15% of the equipment cost is provided by the applicant. So a meaningful amount of funding is now provided. And based on SB 513, a resources board worked with air districts, developed the new guidelines, and those were adopted by ARB's board on April 27th, just a couple of weeks ago. On our Carl Moyer program on our side, we also have developed the online application program, which is available for the first time this year. And so applicants can basically go and apply online. It minimizes the paperwork. It facilitates our reporting and our interaction with Air Resources Board. Yes, sir.
Was that applicant 50% or 15%?
15. The cost effectiveness limit that has been increased based on the new guidelines, this slide shows, for example, for the on-road category, and it is based on type of equipment, whether you are funding locomotives, marine vessels, trucks, and so on. So for trucks, those who are would like to repower, say, their equipment or purchase to 0.2 gram, which is the required certification, the cost effectiveness have been raised from the current $18,260 per ton to $30,000 per ton. That's throughout the program. However, if one wants to take the extra step and fund or purchase the optional certified level of near zero at 0.02 or zero emission technologies for their trucks, the cost effectiveness can be raised to $100,000 per ton. So a meaningful amount of funding can be provided. And based on this, the funds that can be provided are very compatible to our other program, which is Proposition 1B fund. So for, say, a 0.02 gram natural gas engine, an applicant should be able to get somewhere close to $100,000 for a 0.02 gram natural gas truck. The year 19 allocation that we got from a resources board under SB 1107 is about $25 million. We are required to provide about $4 million our local match, which we provide from our AB 923 funds, the DMV fee. So we will have about $30 million available for our year 19 program. Our program announcement was issued at our April board meeting, April 7th. Even though it was issued before Air Resources Board adopted their new guidelines, we mentioned that contingent upon approval of those guidelines, we will apply the new guidelines in this round, so people will be able to get the higher amount of funding that the new guidelines allow. Tentatively, we have allocated $24 million of our funding for the Moyer program, and the other $4 million for soon provision. These are the large off-road construction equipment operators, but these are tentative allocation. It will depend how many applications we get for each category. We'll go back to the board and recommend a final dollar amount and so on. We usually also have some money from projects that were not completed due to whatever reason by the applicant, so we put those monies back into the pot and fund additional projects. The categories that will be funding on the on and off-road side, again, is the type of equipment you see. Since last year, we have been able to get a lot of agricultural tractors. We did a huge outreach in the desert and brought agricultural tractors. And this year, for the first time, again, hopefully we'll be able to fund a lot of on-road vehicles because the delta, the emission reduction increment had decreased so much we could not provide enough funding with the old guidelines. But this time we should be able to be funding on-road projects. Our schedule is that we issued our program announcement April 7th. We are closing July 11th. And this is our annual schedule. We'll go back to the board in October timeframe to recommend the new projects. And this is the schedule of the workshops. We mail out about 25,000 brochures detailing the availability of the program, amount of funding. We have general workshops and we have equipment-specific workshops. In addition to this, we're going to have one workshop in Riverside for agricultural tractors and agriculture off-road equipment. And we are also, we are having one specific workshop for refuse haulers and also transit bus operators in case they are interested to repower their buses to the 0.02 gram engine, which is certified and commercially available. We are trying to basically bring them to one meeting and helping them in case they are interested in applying. This concludes my slides, but I have one additional information to give is that since Moyer has been so successful and under our AQMP we are looking for additional incentive funding program, there is one legislation that South Coast proposed. It's called AB 1274. And it is sponsored by, it is introduced by Assemblyman O'Donnell. What this legislation does is it will basically increase the Moyer funding statewide by 2.3 times. So we'll go somewhere from $69 million a year statewide to $160 million. And the way we are increasing this funding is actually at no cost to consumers. What we are proposing is at this time, if you have a brand new car, the first smog check is due after 6 years. When we see the numbers from Bureau of Automotive Repair, only about 3 to 4% of these vehicles fail at their first smog check. So we are proposing to postpone the first smog check from year 6 to year 8. And what will happen is when the consumers pay about $50 for smog check and another $8 for a certificate, instead of $58, at year 7 and 8, $24 a year, so total of $48 will be charged as smog abatement fee. So there will be about $10 saving for consumers. They will save the trouble of going to smog check station. And then this $48, all of it will go to Air Pollution Control Fund that ARB can use the entire amount for the Moyer program. And when we look at the numbers, our own numbers show that compared to the disbenefits of that 3 to 4% of failure of new vehicles at their smog check, the emission reduction that we can realize with this additional funding from the Moyer program will be somewhere between 2 to 4 times more. And that's only NOx. In addition to that, we reduce PM from diesel emissions. And also we have the ability under Moyer to allocate this funding, at least half of them, to disproportionately impacted areas. So the benefit is going to be more, and it's going to be close to the source of pollution. And what has happened with this bill, we already have gone to Assembly's Transportation Committee a couple of weeks ago, and the bill passed by a vote of 11-2. So the next part would be moving to the Assembly's Appropriation Committee in the near future. That concludes my presentation.
Actually, just an update. Actually, went to approps already, Assembly approps. They put on the suspense file, so it'll be. Actually, it's not bad. It's actually good. There's no presentation. It's going to be taken up at in approps again later on in the month, later on in May, I believe, or maybe early June, and then, but it's going to get voted on as a whole. All these bills that are on suspense are all going to get voted as a whole and gets to the Assembly and then goes on to the Senate.
Hey, Fred, I got a question. This is a great program. It's been around a long time. I remember when it first came out around here. But in your opinion, looking at it futuristically, haven't 90% of the buses gone through this upgrade with Moyer? So really, there's not many buses left per se, because the new ones, the technology is pretty good. Is the shift now going to be to off-road and tractors?
Well, throughout the years, that is what has happened. When the program started at its first 5 years, the majority of the vehicles we were funding were on-road vehicles, trucks, refuse haulers, transit buses, and so on. Then there were more regulations on that part. We basically converted the diesel fleet to natural gas, such as MTA and other transit operators. And then we started funding off-road equipment, construction, marine vessels, locomotives, and so on. Where we are now, actually, even though we have a natural gas, say, transit bus fleet or refuse haul fleet, but those that are, say, model year pre-2010, the certification level is at 1.2 gram, and we can offer 0.02. So they can either repower or replace. They have both choices for their vehicle. So we can still continue with those projects. And then our ultimate goal is zero emission. We can also provide funding for that.
And lastly, I need your take on this, because it's kind of the gray area when AQMD and public money uses upgrade on trains and the railroad business. It'd be different if the railroads were starving to death or they're poor little entities, but just the opposite. They're quite powerful still. And what's the gray area there?
Well, we are very careful with that. One example I can give is that the project we are doing with Metrolink at this moment, we have provided about $110 million to Metrolink to replace 40 locomotives from Tier 0 and Tier 1 to Tier 4. That's the state of the technology. A couple of them already have been delivered. It's the first metro operator in the nation that has done that. Now, the entire project amount is about $260 million. The remaining money that has been provided by Metro has several sources. They are bond funds, public funds, and so on. But we have been careful in basically architecting our contract in a way that legally our money goes and co-funds the project with source of funds that is allowable. So if there is any specific amount of public funds that goes, say, to train number 4, and we are not allowed to put Moyer money in that specific train, then we don't do that. So we go case by case. We get approval from Air Resources Board, and then we tailor our contract so funds are not commingled illegally.
Yeah, Derek, who's opposing 1274? Do you know?
So some of the opposition is the New Car Dealers Association. They're opposing it. Philip, you recall anybody out?
Smog check stations?
Yeah, there's actually no official opposition, but there's been folks that we've been talking to that have concerns. So we're hoping they won't officially go into opposition, but they do have some suggestions that we're trying to see if we need to incorporate into the bill.
Yeah, because
So-
Carl Moyer's been a godsend to my construction industry folks over the years, and it's a good program.
We have Derek can talk or Philip, but we have official support from Bay Area AQMD, CAPCOA,
San Joaquin Air District, also CalSTART, CAPCOA, Bay Area. Yeah, I think we have, that should be about it, maybe 5 or 6 or so.
Because I guess I was concerned more about the private sector, and I was thinking that'd be pretty hard pressed to oppose that.
But I think you're right. I think the smog check stations, if they band together, are going to oppose this. And
I just had one car smog checked yesterday. My next one is November, I think.
So let me ask you, how much did that cost? Seriously.
$62 or $3.
Did that include your certificate?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I had to go over to the auto club to get my tags.
Okay.
and bring
So
them.
it would have been a net savings for you had you been able to go through this program, right? Well,
Well,
I don't
then
know how old your car is. How old is
Then
it?
then I wouldn't have to wait till for what?
Well,
instead
how
of
old?
3 years?
Yeah, how old is your car?
Well, this particular one is a classic '95
Oh, no,
vehicle saver,
no,
but
no.
No, but regardless,
it would've
if you pay $62 for that smog check, say if you had a car that you were taking for the first time after 6 years, you would still pay that amount. Now that gets deferred 2 years. Instead of $68, you will pay just $48,
Right.
which is a net saving of $14, and then saves you the trouble of going to do the smog check.
But your car's in 95, you said?
95.
95, so it wouldn't actually, you still need to get a smog. It's only your cars that are in year 7 and 8 that would not have to get their cars smogged. Anything beyond that, you have to go based on whatever the regular schedule is.
I am never selling that one, but
And there's also a few business groups, LA Chamber, VICA, and LA County BizFed that are basically in interim policy committee support positions and looking to finalize them as well. So we're getting pretty broad stakeholder support.
One thing I want to mention, SB 513 that I mentioned changed the guidelines a year and a half ago. We had no opposition at the time, but it wasn't a fiscal bill. We just needed 50% majority, but nonetheless, Senate approved that, I believe, 40-0, and we had basically there were no groups that were opposing that. But this one, we would need 2/3 majority because it's still considered as a fiscal bill.
All right, very good. No other questions? Thank you very much. Our next item is another bill, SB 1. That was part of the deal that why we got our bill signed today. So, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Philip Crabb, Community Relations Manager with Legislative and Public Affairs. Just here to provide an update on SB 1, which was the overall state infrastructure transportation package that was just signed into law not that long ago by Governor Jerry Brown, and that would generate an estimated $52 billion over the next 10 years to serve transportation needs in California. It's been said that the program will cost drivers less than $10 a month and comes with strict new accountability provisions to ensure that all these funds can only be spent on transportation. So just breaking down a little bit some of the numbers, half of the money is to go to fix local streets and transportation infrastructure, basically fix it first, local road repairs, local public transportation, also just promotes $1 billion to promote the walking and bicycling, kind of complete streets concepts, things like that. The other half will be going to state highways and transportation infrastructure, highways, bridges, culverts, trade corridors, things of that nature. Also, it'll have some other provisions like creating an inspector, having an inspector general ensure that Caltrans and any entities receiving state transportation funds spend those dollars efficiently, effectively, and in compliance with requirements. One of the way that the money is being generated is coming from a number of sources, and that's been something that was a little bit of a more of a push to get done. But we have a increase in the diesel excise tax by 20 cents, and that'll generate about $7.3 billion. Increased diesel sales tax to 5.75% for a $3.5 billion generation. $24.4 billion is going to be generated from a 12-cent increase in the gas tax, and $16.3 billion is coming from an annual transportation improvement fee, which basically is scaled based on the value of the vehicle. There's also just $200 million coming from an annual $100 zero-emission vehicle fee that will start in 2020. And $706 million is coming from general fund loan repayments, money that was borrowed previously and is going to be paid back. Other things that this would, basically this was a mostly transportation-focused bill, and one of the issues is that it did not expressly dedicate funds to mitigate air quality impacts for goods moving projects within the bill. And that's something that a lot of groups, including South Coast, were working hard to try to do. I would say that effort continues during this legislative year. But SB 1 included language, for example, that was requiring the retirement, replacement, retrofit, or repower of commercial motor vehicles, mostly trucks, heavy-duty trucks, basically until those vehicles reach 800,000 vehicle miles or have traveled or 18 years old, whichever is earlier, but in no case before 13 years before the year that the engine and emission control system are first certified for use. And basically the intent of that was stated in SB 1 is that the legislature wanted to provide owners of commercial vehicles certainty about the useful life of their vehicles, but it is not meant to otherwise restrict the authority of CARB or the local air districts in terms of doing their rules. So you can see that sounds a little bit confusing, a little ambiguous there. So basically our lead attorneys here have taken a look at it. Basically it's unclear exactly what the potential impacts of SB 1 could have on CARB and AQMD's ability to adopt emission adoption or reduction measures. Because of that intent that's not meant to limit authorities, that is a good thing. I believe CARB and also the State Department of Transportation both issued statements basically along those lines saying that they didn't feel that it restricted CARB or local air districts. But we're concerned that there's an invitation for litigation in the future potentially. So one other item of note is that SB 174 by Senator Lara, which the board had taken a position of support with some technical amendments. That was also included within the provisions of SB 1. And essentially what that does is it requires the DMV to deny registration to trucks and buses that don't meet CARB's clean truck and bus rule mandates. And that was more of a broadly supported effort, basically to allow for even playing field and to increase enforcement of that rule. I think there was maybe about 30% of the folks that were not abiding by the rule, while a lot of other truckers and industry folks were abiding by the rule, so that allows for better enforcement of that. So that's my overall presentation.
Paul?
Phil, a couple of questions. One, in that big, in SB 1, is there like a concerned citizens oversight board in Sacramento as an overseeing board, or it just goes into the general fund of the taxation, because it's quite a lot of money? And why I ask that is if an oversight committee, if there was measuring tools or some type of measuring formulas to say, okay, we raise the taxes, we're putting billions of dollars in the state fund, and I-5 still looks like the Russian army marched over it. Okay, there's no measuring time to fix that. What's your take on that legislatively, or your opinion on it, if there's no oversight on it at all?
Well, part of that is there is a constitutional amendment that was part of the package, basically, to require this money to be used for transportation infrastructure purposes. And there was some level of oversight in terms of making sure that even the local governments are spending the money for transportation improvements. So that was done, doing a constitutional amendment takes another 2/3 vote, and this whole package took that. So this was all part of that deal to make sure that this money goes exactly for what it's meant to be going for.
Does that include funding for the bullet train?
I don't believe there is. I haven't seen much for bullet train. I think that's going to come most out of greenhouse gas reduction fund type monies.
Somehow he didn't get the toy train in this one. So.
Right.
Bill?
Philip, I guess I missed one thing. When you said retirement of vehicles, you're talking about commercial vehicles, not private vehicles, right?
Commercial, yes.
Commercial vehicles.
Don't worry, you can keep your 95 car. You're okay.
Well, I was here when you guys had your vehicle scrapping program, and John Aoyang, I think, was the point guy on that. But your mouth would just salivate with all the classic cars in the lot. You must have had 400 or 500 people out here, and these were the classic car owners who were just outraged that the source of parts were going to go away. They were going to get ground up and crushed. So,
right. Well, there still is a replace your ride program that we have that's good for emissions. I'm not sure about classic car owners though.
Well, there's a guy down in LA that'll take your classic car though and put a EV battery and electric motors in it too.
There you go.
That's another option for those that are on that side. Thank you for the presentation. Any other questions, anyone? All right. That also brings us to our written material that's also attached, and I also wanted to welcome Eddie to our group. Thank you. I guess you got introduced earlier. Is there anything else you want to add to your bio, or let us know any more about you? Or
Mike.
Oh, grab a mic there. Oh yeah, pass a mic down, John.
Oh, it does.
Oh, now we go. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Eddie Marquez. I'm with Alon Energy, which owns Paramount Petroleum. We're kind of a unique oil company because we have the only repurposed oil refinery in the country. We take tallow and turn it into renewable fuel. So exciting time in our industry. We have that facility in the city of Paramount. I'm also a former state member of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, state board member, still one of the executive board members in Orange County. So bring the business and the chamber background to the table. Sounds like a very interesting group. I've learned a lot today. I'm relatively new with my company. I've been with the company for about 5 months. Previously, I was with Southern California Edison, so not new to the utility industry. So I have a lot of old friends in the room. So if anybody has any questions, I'm here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. All right. Anyone have any other business for the body? Oh, Rita?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up and see if maybe we could bring a presentation to this committee on the public outreach that was suggested by staff at the last governing board meeting. There was a request by the Printing Industry Association to do more enhanced outreach to the small business community. And I wonder if we could get like a status report of what those efforts are going to look like.
We'll go ahead and look into that and get back to you, okay?
Okay. I also wonder if we might want to have a presentation here on the gentleman that came in and was bringing up at Stationary Source the issues he was having with his low NOx burners, and get a report back here that came to our body at the board meeting as far as the outreach that the district did to all the other gentlemen or all the other people that had those burners, and how we found out 90% of them were actually operating okay. So it just probably be good to hear how that went and what the outcome of that was. Along those same lines. Okay.
Will do.
Any public comment? Very good. Our next meeting will be back here on June 9th at 11:30. Thank you all for coming.